Brethren. In a society as widely extended as Freemasonry, the branches of which are spread over the 4 quarters of the globe, it cannot be denied that we have many members who have travelled a great distance from east and west to be here today. As well as our own brethren from our overseas districts, we warmly welcome our home Grand Lodges and overseas visitors from 136 sovereign Grand Lodges around the globe, an extraordinary and fitting gathering of the Masonic family on this very special occasion. The United Grand Lodge of England is delighted to welcome to the Royal Albert Hall today the most worshipful Grand Master and brethren from the following Grand Lodges. The Grand Lodge of New Zealand, the Grand Lodge of Tasmania, the Grand Lodge of South Australia and Northern Territory, the Grand Lodge of Western Australia, the United Grand Lodge of New South Wales, the Grand Lodge of the Philippines, the Grand Lodge of India, the Grand Lodge of Russia, the Grand Lodge of Mauritius, the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel, the Grand Lodge of Armenia, the Grand Lodge of Greece, the Grand Lodge of Denmark, the Regular Grand Lodge of Serbia, the Regular Grand Lodge of Italy, the National Grand Lodge of Poland, the Grand Lodge of Congo, the Grand Lodge of Moldova, the Grand Lodge Alpina of Switzerland, the Sovereign Grand Lodge of Malta, the Grand Lodge of Slovenia, the Grand Lodge of South Africa, the Grand Lodge of Luxembourg, the Grand Lodge of Cameroon, the Grand Lodge of Lithuania, the Grand Lodge of Gabon, the Grand Lodge of Macedonia, the Regular Grand Lodge of Belgium, the Grand Lodge of Nigeria, the Grand Lodge of Croatia, the Grand Lodge of Latvia, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, the Grand Lodge of Iceland, the Grand Lodge of Quebec, the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon, the Grand Lodge of Alaska, the Grand Lodge of Nova Scotia, the Grand Lodge of Minnesota, the Grand Lodge of Canada, Ontario, the Grand Lodge of Oregon, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, the Grand Lodge of Maine, the Grand Lodge of Wyoming, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of California, the Grand Lodge of South Dakota, the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin, the Grand Lodge of New Mexico, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ontario, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Wisconsin, the Grand Lodge of Vermont, the Grand Lodge of Kansas, the Grand Lodge of North Carolina, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Nevada, the Grand Lodge of Connecticut, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of New York, the Grand Lodge of Indiana, the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of New Jersey, the Grand Lodge of Arizona, the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, the Grand Lodge of Cuba, the Grand Lodge of Prince Edward Island, the Grand Orient of Haiti, 1824, the Grand Lodge of Washington, the Grand Lodge of the State of Vera Cruz, the Grand Lodge of the Republic of Venezuela, the Grand Lodge of Ecuador, the Occidental Grand Lodge of Colombia at Cali, the Grand Lodge of Peru, the Grand Orient of Brazil, the Grand Lodge of Colombia at Bogota, the Grand Lodge of Bolivia, the Grand Lodge of the State of Espiritu Santo, the symbolic Grand Lodge of Paraguay, the Grand Lodge of the State of Sao Paulo, the Grand Lodge of Chile, the Grand Lodge of the State of Mato Grosso do Sul, the Grand Lodge of the State of Rio Grande do Sul, the Grand Lodge of Uruguay, the United Grand Lodge of Victoria, the United Grand Lodge of Queensland, the Grand Lodge of Japan, the Grand Lodge of China, the Grand Lodge of Turkey, the United Grand Lodge of Bulgaria, the Grand Lodge of Finland, the Grand Lodge of Cyprus, the Grand Lodge of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Grand Lodge of Norway, the Grand Lodge of Estonia, the United Grand Lodges of Germany, the Grand Lodge of Sweden, the National Grand Lodge of Romania, the National Grand Lodge of Guinea, the National Grand Lodge of France, the symbolic Grand Lodge of Hungary, the Grand East of the Netherlands, the Grand Lodge of the Czech Republic, the National Regular Grand Lodge of the Principality of Monaco, the Grand Lodge of Austria, the Grand Lodge of Ghana, the Grand Lodge of Slovakia, the Regular Grand Lodge of Portugal, the Grand Lodge of Burkina Faso, the Grand Lodge of Spain, the Regular Grand Lodge of the Kingdom of Morocco, the Grand Lodge of Ivory Coast, the Grand Lodge of Ireland, the Grand Lodge of Newfoundland and Labrador, the Grand Lodge of Alberta, the Grand Lodge of Michigan, the Grand Lodge of Montana, the Grand Lodge of Manitoba, the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Nevada, the Grand Lodge of Colorado, the Grand Lodge of California, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, the Grand Lodge of Ohio, the Grand Lodge of Missouri, the Grand Lodge of Rhode Island, the Grand Lodge of Texas, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Colorado, the Grand Lodge of New York, the Grand Lodge of Virginia, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, the Grand Lodge of Utah, the Grand Lodge of New Brunswick, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Kansas, the Grand Lodge of New Jersey, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois, the Grand Lodge of Maryland, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Missouri, the Grand Lodge of Los Andes, the York Grand Lodge of Mexico. May we unite today, as always, in the grand design of being happy and communicating happiness.